neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at installing the Demco Premier Series above bed base rail kit with custom installation kit for fifth wheels on a 2020 Chevy Silverado 3500. The Demco Base Rails are going to be a great addition to any truck that requires a fifth wheel, or if you're having some adventures coming along where you need that fifth wheel. Having base rails means that you can drop in just about any brand. These follow an ISR standard, which is going to be the basic spacing to be able to drop a base of a fifth wheel in. And kind of the great thing about these is you can still remove your fifth wheel from the bed, and that way when you still need to use a truck for truck things, you really don't take up a whole lot of space here. You just have a little bit of raising here on the bed just where the rails are, but overall this isn't going to stop you from putting 2x4s or anything else in the back of your bed. The rails sit just slightly in front of the axle, so we have a 6.5 foot bed here. So from the front, we obviously have a toolbox here, but from the front of the bed to the edge of the rail, we're looking at about 25.5 inches. From each of your wheel wells to the side, you're looking about 4.5 inches. And then from the end of our bed to our rail here is going to be about 29.5. So this is a 6.5 foot bed. Something I would recommend when picking a fifth wheel up is getting one that has a slide feature, and that's just going to allow you to get some of those sharper corners, make those tight turns without having to worry about your cab corner getting hit. Today we actually have a Patriot slider that we're going to be dropping in here, which is a great option. When you drop your fifth wheel in, it's just going to bolt up using the pins included with that fifth wheel. And that's the great part, is you see a bunch of different slots here, and that means it's going to work with a bunch of different brands. So just because we have a B&W, it doesn't matter that it's working with a Demco, and the same thing goes if you have a Reese, a Kurt, or any brand, it should drop into these rails with no problem. Now, if you have an existing fifth wheel, it is going to work, with this, but you are going to want to have a fifth wheel handy when installing this. That's going to really set exactly where it needs to be. So if you're choosing a fifth wheel head or a whole fifth wheel system while getting your rails, something, again, I'll mention is sliding. On a shorter bed, you really get into issues when you make tight turns, and you can hit the corner of your truck. And really that's just kind of the downside of those shorter beds, but not to worry, you can still navigate those turns. Something like the Patriot here, you would get out of your truck, pull this handle, and this will slide back, and that's just going to really open it up as far as clearance goes. Some of the other ones out there, there's the Demco Auto Slide, which will automatically do it. It's quite a heavy unit, but it is pretty cool. You don't have to mess with that. So no matter what brand you go with, again, with those shorter beds, a sliding fifth wheel is definitely something you're at least going to want to take a look at and do some homework on before purchasing. And while the base rails are pretty standard across the board, you're going to have a ton of extra hardware in your kit because this is designed to work with custom fit brackets specific to the Silverado. And that means it's going to bolt up directly to the frame rail. There is going to be some drilling required, not only just drilling through your bed corrugation to get your rails in place, but also the brackets bolt into the frame, so that way it's nice and sturdy. Going along with that, I really don't see any issues if you were going to run airbags or anything along those lines that would get in the way. And overall, it's actually not too hard of an installation to do. You are going to be underneath your truck for a little bit, drilling away, and some of the hardware is slightly hard to get to, but overall, it's not a whole lot of hardware to bolt down. You could probably knock this out in your driveway or garage, and I'd give yourself maybe about 3 hours or so. And then from there, you'll be ready to drop in your fifth wheel and hit the road. Beginner installation, we're going to want to lower down our spare tire and also get our heat shield removed. That's going to give us a lot more real estate underneath as we're going to be drilling out spots and getting hardware in place. Something else you're going to want to do is make sure that you have your fifth wheel base handy, because we're going to be using that to really gauge exactly where that front rail needs to be. So we'll be dropping that in later, but make sure you have it handy. So we'll get this removed. To get your heat shield down, there's going to be two 13mm bolts that bolt in the frame rail, so you're going to probably want an extension here. We'll go ahead and get these removed. Now what I recommend doing to get the proper measurements is we are going to have our rails already in the bed, and they have you attach the rails to your fifth wheel base and then shimmy it. I think it's a lot easier to get our measurements and get this in a spot where we're happy with it and make reference marks. That way we can put it exactly back where it needs to go. And we'll start by using the rear rail, and that's going to get our first measurement. And the way we're going to do that is by taking our tape measure, and we're going to measure back 32 1/8. And so we do have a spray and bed liner that accounts for roughly about 1/8 of an inch. So we'll go 32 1/4. And what I'm going to do is kind of just center this up. You'll see using just the corrugation here, just kind of eyeball. It doesn't have to be perfect right now, but we're going to be using these second holes in on both sides. So roughly in that area, we're going to make a center point. And then I'm also, once we get that measurement, going to mark here. The main thing is knowing exactly where it needs to go. So we'll take this, and it's going back to the center line of our base rail here. So at 32 1/4, I'll mark right here. And then I'm going to just make a couple more reference lines. That way we can line it all up. Now I've looked at those reference marks, and then I measured from the end of the rail to the front here, and that way we know that it's all at least nice and parallel or perpendicular with the bed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make markings here at the front. That way we have that reference when we start moving it with the base, and we can align that. And then what we'll also do is get a side to side. So measuring from you can use a reference mark in the corrugation, or you can use the bed side or the fender here, as long as it's not too dented up, and make sure that it's even across the board. Once it's even side to side, I like to mark the corners too. Again, this just makes a nice reference mark to really get it dialed in. And this is just a chalk marker. It'll come off with water, but you can really use anything to mark this out. This is definitely an important step. This sets the tone for the rest of the installation, so really taking your time to make sure that it's exactly where you need it is going to be key. So at this point, grab your fifth wheel base, and we're going to get this loaded up into our rail. And we're going to line it up with that back rail, trying to keep it in place. And then have your front rail ready, because as we kind of get the back one in place, take the front, and we'll do the same thing. We're going to just drop that in, and then we can pin it up. With everything pinned in, our rail did shift a little bit, and that's kind of normal, but the good thing is we have our reference marks here. We can just line that up, make sure it's good across the board. And once you kind of get that back to your reference mark, keep that kind of in place, but push this rail up as much as you can. You may not move a whole lot, but generally that's going to give us a nice threshold. That way it drops in nice and easy each time. Now we can make our first holes by drilling out. I'm just using a pilot bit right now. We're going to step this up. And we're only going to be focusing on this rear rail for now. And we're going to, as I mentioned before, we're going to use the second one in, so where the corrugation goes down. And we're going to just square this up as much as we can, and then drill down. With the pilot holes drilled, we can now shift our rails back. Again, this is why having those good marks come in place. That way we can get it back in later. And we're going to just take, they have a 5/8 drill bit, what they recommend in the instructions. I actually recommend going slightly larger sometimes getting that perfectly square in, it kind of gets tricky for that hardware to pass down. So it's just slightly bigger. I have an 11/16, but whatever you have handy, if you need to waller it out a little bit, you can do that. And we'll just go ahead and we're going to enlarge those holes. Once you've enlarged that hole, grab the carriage bolt. This is what we're going to be passing through the rail. Just test to make sure that it passes through well. If you have any metal burrs or anything, you can use a burr bit or a file to get those ground down. And we're going to vacuum up our shrapnel here. And since that's going to be raw exposed metal, we want to make sure that long term it's not going to turn to rust or corrosion. So just with either a paint marker or a little bit of spray paint, just coat that. Now we're able to slide this back over and get our carriage bolts put in place, but something that we're going to need to do is grab the spacers from the kit. And this is just going to go around the hole, so if you need to flop it to one side or the other, this is just going to make sure that it's not going to crush the corrugation on your bed as we tighten it. So a little helpful tip, if you're not using the corrugation filler here on the top, you are going to have one on the bottom. So regardless, this is again just to kind of keep the bed all not crushed down. So we'll be putting them on this one here. And then we'll raise this up over that spacer. And then then I'll pass my carriage bolt down. And it's a good chance to check our reference marks again, make sure everything's nice and aligned. Those carriage bolts are going to kind of at least hold this in place, but again, double check to make sure it hasn't shifted. And then, as I mentioned before, I'm going to push my rail towards the cab all the way forward. And then we're just going to repeat the same process on the same holes. So go ahead, you can drill that out. You can enlarge it, and we'll make sure to put that spacer in the corrugation as well. Now our side brackets are going to feed in the wheel well. So in the instructions they say to remove your tire and your wheel well liner. You really don't need to remove the tire. It's still definitely able to be done without that. The wheel well liner though is going to be a little bit tricky just because we're going to be working in this area. Our truck already had them removed, so we don't have to worry about that. But if you have yours, you do want to take those back or at least pry them up to where you can get access in here. We're going to be doing some drilling and we're going to be tightening down hardware. So to get that out of the way is definitely going to help. On the passenger side, there's another additional heat shield that will have 13mm bolts that are on the frame rail and then also on the two cross members. If you take that out of the way, that's also going to help a lot when it comes to tightening the hardware. But pretty easy here. These brackets are not side specific. We just want these tabs kind of facing in. This portion is going to sit against our frame. So as we slide this kind of back here, we can see our studs from our carriage bolts that pass down. They're going to be right here. And we're going to raise this up. And I'm just going to use one of our flange nuts just to kind of hold it in place. We don't need to tighten this down because we're going to be taking this down quickly just to basically create a template for ourselves. But to have this held up by that flange nut is going to help. So the carriage bolt's holding this in place. What we're going to do is press our frame against the frame of the truck and then raise this up all the way to where it's sitting flush on the bed corrugation. Now it does kind of rest well. We have these brackets here for our overload springs. It does fit over there. It does look pretty tight, but you can see it kind of rests on the edge, especially on this front side, and that's a good sign that it's bumped up enough to where it's at a good spot. So if you need to, you can grab a clamp and clamp this on the frame, but all we're doing here is getting the template for where we're going to be drilling in our hardware. So I just have a smaller drill bit. I'm going to center this up, and I'm just going to mark it. You can use a punch or a paint marker, it doesn't really matter here. Do the same on the other. And now we can take our bracket back down. Now I'm going to drill out that pilot hole, and we're going to slowly work our way up to a larger bit and eventually stepping it up to an 11/16. That's going to allow us to get our flange nut or flange bolt in the frame to bolt this up. So I got those drilled out, so take your flange bolt, just make sure it passes through nice and easy like that. You should have just a little bit of a gap, and that's going to allow for our pull wire to be able to thread on this. Now, to get this bolt in place, there's two different ways you can do it. There's this access hole on the outside. The problem with this one is it is just a little too big to get this to pass through. So you can just kind of grind away at the top or bottom for this to pass through. And the other option is on the back side, there's a larger access hole that this will pass through. But in order to get to it, you may have to move some wire loom and you may have to move some hard lines. On the passenger side, it's not as difficult. You can definitely use those access holes. But since we're here, got a grinding bit, I'm going to just kind of take a little notch out of that so we can get our hardware passed through. Now, I went ahead, I notched that. It is very minor, but it's just enough to where we can kind of twist that bolt in. Again, you don't have to do that. You can use the access holes, but this is nice to have right here on the same side. And now we can go ahead, we'll slide this back into place, and then I'm going to just get our top bolts hand tightened in. If you need to, just snug that up, and it should get these holes aligned. Now before we get everything tightened up, you're going to want to leave a little bit of space so we can feed our bolt through that access hole. The bracket does kind of get in the way. So we're going to start on the further back hole and take your pull wire. The coiled end is going to feed through these holes. And if you need to put bends on your pull wire, you can absolutely do that to fish this back to our access hole. And grab hold of that coiled section. You may have to kind of feel around for it. Now if you're struggling to get that pull wire pulled through, you can use this access hole that's back here. It's just kind of tucked behind the wire loom. And once you have that coil fed through there, just take your bolt, thread this on. We'll then pass this into our frame rail. And then we'll head to the other side as we pull this out. And it might be helpful to still have your brace a little bit loose from the top if you need to slide this around to get this to pull through, because it can get a little bit tight here. And also be careful with your pull wire, because we're going to need to reuse this for the other remaining 3 studs. So just kind of take your time until you can get it passed through. And once passed through, take your pull wire and thread it off. And keep a finger on the bolt. You want to make sure that doesn't pass back down into the frame. And you're going to want your serrated flange nut ready. And then we'll just get that started here. Kind of hold that in place. I'm going to leave that a little bit loose for now. So using the access hole was definitely nice to use on this one. The one up here, there's some hard lines, and the fuel tank's right there. It's pretty tight. So what we're going to do is where we notch this portion, we're going to take just this fish wire, feed this through, and we're going to feed it in that way. Now, to get this one in place, there is an access hole on the other side, but there's going to be hard lines in the way as well as the fuel tank. So where we just kind of notched this access hole on the outside, we're going to be using that. And you might want to have your brace, not completely tight. That way you can kind of move this up, and we'll just pass it through here. Get this pulled through. Get this threaded off. And I do wish Demco supplied us with a few more pull wires because these are not exactly easy to get off. So really just take your time here because we are going to be having to reuse this. And then we can hand tighten all these down. And the serrated flange bolt is going to want to kind of walk around, so if you just pull on it as you're tightening it, that's going to kind of keep that in place. Now something that you're going to want to do as well is get some thread lock on here. So I'm just going to coat this on our studs before passing this on, and that's just going to help. And all of the hardware is going to need to receive thread lock, so make sure you're doing that. Now at this point we have all of our hardware started. Try to get it as snug as you can with your hand, and then we're going to come back with a 15/16 socket to get these snugged down, and the top ones we're going to be using a ratcheting 15/16 wrench to get those tightened down. We're going to be coming back with a torque wrench, so the main thing is we're just drawing it in close to the frame and also tightening it from the top. So we'll go ahead, we'll get everything all snugged down. Now at this point, you should have your other side installed. If you haven't, go ahead and do the exact same steps that we did on the other side. And as I mentioned before, the heat shield that kind of lives up here, highly recommend taking that down. There's just going to be 4 13mm bolts. Two of them are going to be up here on the frame rail, the other two, one on the cross member, one on that upper one. Totally worth taking out because otherwise getting to this hardware to torque it down is really tricky. Speaking of that, to get these torqued down with our torque wrench, I'm going to be using a crow's foot attachment because it's pretty tight here. You can't really get a socket on there. So this is going to be the best method, I think, for us to get this torque down properly. As far as the torque setting goes, you're just going to refer to your instruction manual and you'll find, based on the hardware, what you'll be using. So we'll get this in place. We'll get this all torqued down. With all of the hardware torqued down, we do want to check to make sure that it's not too tight. And what happens a lot of times is we'll bolt these all up, and then with the pins out, you can't even raise this up. So what you're looking for, you could leave the back pins in. You should be able to just raise this up, drop it down, and that's going to kind of help knock off any of that powder coat and just kind of create a nice spot for it to drop in. If you can't get this out and you have to pry it up, you might want to head down there, loosen up some of that hardware just a little bit, drop this in and out a few more times, and then re-torque it down. That's going to make it a lot easier when the time comes to get your fifth wheel out of your bed. So now at this point, everything's bolted in up top here. We just have to finish our fifth wheel, but for you at home, you just want to make sure you get your spare tire, both your heat shields, as well as your inner fender liners back on, and then you're ready to hit the road. And that was a look at installation of the Demco Premier Series base rails above bed for fifth wheel hitches with custom brackets.